Marvel doesn't always write its mutants out with a dramatic ending. Sometimes they just disappear. One storyline shift, one roster change, and characters who once stood beside the X-Men vanish without explanation. Mutants with powerful abilities, deep connections, and real potential are suddenly erased from focus as new faces take over. They didn't fall in battle or retire, they were simply left behind as the narrative moved on. But how do X-Men characters just vanish without a trace? Here are 10 X-Men characters who completely vanished. At number 10 is Kylun or Colin McKay. Introduced as a child in Excalibur issue 2 in November 1988 as a child, Colin McKay was a mutant who could perfectly mimic any sound. After an exile to a mystical alternate dimension, he grew into an elite adult warrior wielding twin magical swords that cut through anything except innocent life. Joining the British mutant team Excalibur, he became a key player during the massive Necrom storyline and formed a brotherly bond with Nightcrawler. Then, he abruptly vanished. In Excalibur issue 67 in 1993, Kylun stepped away to reunite with his parents. The real reason for his sudden disappearance was that creator Alan Davis left the book. New writers systematically cleared out original concepts to refocus the title on core Marvel characters, and Kylun was simply left behind. Today, aside from a literal silent cameo in the background of a mutant crowd 26 years later, inside the 2019 Excalibur relaunch, Kylun remains entirely abandoned across all modern comic book stories. At number 9 is Adam X, or the X-Treme. Introduced during the 1990s in X-Force Annual Issue 2 in 1993 by Fabian Nicieza and Tony Daniel, Adam X was a human/Shi'ar hybrid who used his blades to lacerate opponents, exposing their oxygenated blood so he could ignite their electrolytes. Epitomizing extreme 90s comic edge, he sported a backward hat and countless blades. He wasn't a minor extra. Adam X was a standout presence, heavily teased as the legendary Third Summer's brother, the secret sibling to Cyclops and Havoc. He crossed paths with X-Force, the X-Men, and saved Cyclops' grandfather before suddenly vanishing from the narrative following X-Men issue 41 in 1995. This disappearance occurred because Nicieza clashed with editorial and departed Marvel. The plot was abandoned for decades before Marvel quietly wrapped it up in 2021's X-Men Legends, officially confirming his Summers DNA years after anyone cared. Today, while Marvel occasionally uses him as a quick punchline to mock ridiculous 90s comic book design tropes, as a serious mutant character with a properly resolved narrative, he remains one of the most famous abandoned plots in all of X-Men publishing history. At number 8 is Omerta or Polly Provenzano. Introduced in the early 2000s in Uncanny X-Men issue 392 in 2001 by Scott Lobdell and Salvador Larroca, Omerta, or Polly Provenzano, was an arrogant Brooklyn mobster. After discovering his mutant invulnerability and incredible strength, Jean Grey desperately recruited him into an emergency X-Men team when Magneto captured Professor X on Genosha. Polly was central to the Eve of Destruction storyline, which highlighted his intense culture clash, deep prejudices, and a fierce rivalry with Northstar that he was slowly learning to overcome. And then, he just walked away. Following the successful Genoshan mission in X-Men issue 113 in 2001, the makeshift team disbanded and Polly walked away. His disappearance happened because Eve of Destruction was a filler story bridging the gap before Grant Morrison took over the franchise. Morrison revamped the roster, and bridge characters were immediately discarded. He never died and was not depowered. He has just been actively ignored by writers for over 2 full decades now. If you think a forgotten mobster is wild, wait until you see the mutants coming up. We've got an alien hybrid surfer, an invisible spy, and a core X-Man who literally walked away from the team without a trace. At number 7 is the third Thunderbird, or Neil Shara. Introduced during the early 2000s in X-Men issue 100 in 2000 by Chris Claremont and Lionel Francis Yu, Neil Shara was a pyrokinetic mutant from India who took up the mantle of Thunderbird. He joined the main X-Men team before transitioning to Storm's splinter group in X-Treme X-Men. Neil was a prominent fixture, serving as a core X-Men member for almost 3 years. He had major romantic storylines involving Psylocke and Lifeguard, and was central to the team's hunt for Destiny's Diaries. Then, he completely vanished. In X-Treme X-Men issue 19 in 2002, Neil abruptly left the team alongside his girlfriend, Lifeguard, to search for her missing brother, never to return. This sudden disappearance happened because Neil was heavily favored by Claremont. When the title ended and the team folded back into the main books, other writers had zero interest in utilizing him. Today, despite being an official X-Man, he remains missing, restricted entirely to a wordless background cameo inside a mutant bar on Krakoa. At number 6 is Slipstream, or Davis Cameron. Introduced during the early 2000s in Extreme X-Men issue 6 by Chris Claremont and Salvador Larroca, Davis Cameron was an Australian surfer who discovered he was a mutant. He generated a warp wave surfboard that allowed him to teleport anywhere on Earth. Joining the team alongside his sister Lifeguard, Slipstream became a heavy hitter, frequently featured in their battles against alien invasions. However, his storyline took a dark turn when it was revealed that he and his sister shared alien DNA, physically transforming them. Horrified by this heritage and unable to cope with his changing appearance, Slipstream suffered a mental breakdown and literally ran away from his squad in Extreme X-Men issue 18. This disappearance occurred because the character was tied exclusively to Claremont's specific run. His sudden exit was meant to be a cliffhanger, but when the creative direction shifted, no other writer ever picked up the thread to find out what truly happened. To this day, his fate remains an entirely unresolved cliffhanger. At number 5 is Cipher, or Elisa Tager. Introduced during the late 2000s in Young X-Men issue 8 in 2008 by Mark Guggenheim and Rafa Sandoval, Elisa Tager was a mutant possessing absolute stealth capabilities. She could turn invisible, phase seamlessly through solid objects, mask her psychic signature from telepaths, and hide her thermal output. Her dramatic reveal was a massive twist. She had actually been living at the Xavier Institute among the other students entirely undetected for an extended period, acting as Cyclops' secret spy. She played a pivotal role in saving the Young X-Men team from the villain Donald Pierce, before fading into the background of the Utopia era. She remained a brief background character when the mutants moved to Utopia, but by 2011, she vanished completely. This happened because her unique power set made her exceptionally difficult to write. A character whose primary trait is being entirely unnoticeable is hard to integrate into team dynamics after her initial surprise storyline concludes. Ironically, living up to her mutant powers, she has faded out of sight entirely. At number 4 is Indra, or Paras Gavaskar. Introduced during the 2000s in New X-Men, Academy X issue 7 in 2004 by Nunzio De Filippis, Christina Weir, and Michael Ryan, Indra, or Paras Gavaskar, was a mutant from India generating organic armor and weapons. However, as a devout Jain, his religion strictly forbade violence. His entire arc was built around the excruciating moral dilemma of a pacifist drafted into a mutant war. He became a major focal point in the X-Men Legacy series around 2010. He had a highly emotional arc where Rogue accompanied him back to India, dealing with severe family trauma and ultimately being forced to use his powers violently to save his friends, shattering his religious vows. Shortly after this heavy, character-defining arc concluded, Indra just disappeared, fading into the background of the Jean Grey School before vanishing completely from rosters. This happened because Academy X had too many characters. Deeply introspective, non-combat mutants were benched to save page space. Today, he still remains missing. But from here, the disappearances become even more shocking. Coming up in our top 3, we have an unbreakable mutant bond severed by editors, and a character whose absence created a glaring plot hole for over a decade. At number 3 is Primal, or Tion Macic, introduced during the 2010s in Uncanny X-Men issue 529 in 2010 by Matt Fraction and Kieron Gillen. Tion Macic was one of the first new mutants to manifest powers after the M-Day decimation. His mutation granted him hyper-enhanced physical abilities, but fundamentally altered his brain, reducing his communication to animalistic grunts and deeply tying him to Hope Summers as her protector. Primal was a core cast member in the Generation Hope series. He had a brilliant standalone issue where he stood trial to prove his sentience, revealing a profound, hyper-efficient primal intelligence beneath his animal-like exterior. And then, the narrative completely left him behind. When Generation Hope was canceled in 2012, Hope moved into the massive Avengers vs. X-Men event. Tion was left behind at the school and immediately ceased to exist in the narrative. This happened because his entire concept relied on his specific bond with Hope. At number 2 is Sprite, or Jia Jing. introduced during the 2010 era in Wolverine, and the X-Men issue 1 in 2011 by Jason Aaron and Chris Bachalo. Jia Jing, also known as Sprite, was a young mutant capable of generating solid rock armor around her body and flying. She was notably one of the very first new students recruited to Wolverine's newly founded Jean Grey School. At one point, Sprite was heavily featured throughout the entire Wolverine and the X-Men run. She went on dangerous field missions, fought bravely in the Hellfire Academy arc, and formed very close friendships with other new students like Eye-Boy and Shark Girl. Then, her storyline hit a dead end. Following her inclusion in the Spider-Man and the X-Men miniseries in 2015, Sprite abruptly vanished from all school rosters and crowd scenes. This likely happened because she suffered from new student syndrome. As her peers caught the interest of future writers, Sprite was just the unlucky student left waiting in the wings. At number 1 is Lifeguard. Introduced during the early 2000s in Extreme X-Men issue 6 in 2001 by Chris Claremont and Salvador Larroca, Heather Cameron, known as Lifeguard, possessed a mutant ability to manifest whatever physical trait was required to save a life. She and her brother Slipstream joined the Extreme X-Men. Lifeguard stood out as a central member, developing a romance with Thunderbird. Her story peaked when she discovered she possessed Shi'ar alien DNA, which permanently transformed her physical appearance, granting her golden skin and wings. Then, her storyline hit a brick wall. In Extreme X-Men issue 19 in 2002, after her brother fled due to their alien heritage, Heather abruptly left the team alongside Thunderbird to search for him. This sudden disappearance happened because her character was exclusively tied to Claremont's specific run. When creative direction shifted, subsequent writers simply ignored her completely. Today, despite her unique powers and unresolved mission to find her brother, Lifeguard remains completely missing from all modern X-Men comic book storylines and mutant teams. Some mutants vanished, but their stories still matter. Comment your picks and press the subscribe button and bell icons for more deep dives into forgotten X-Men.